All right, welcome back. We have hopefully just answered those first questions and you've uploaded them. We're going to continue our discussion regarding the costs of development and any barriers that might be in the way. Before we get to this slide, the last thing that we mentioned at the end of the last video was regard to political corruption and instability. Right? If you guys remember when we talked about the ladder of development, Rostow's ladder, we talked about the fact that you have to have a government that is willing to invest, that is willing to look at new ideas and be more flexible so that a country can start up that ladder of development. Political corruption, political instability can certainly impede that development because of the fact that you don't have a government that is willing to put its people first, right? That is willing to try new ideas, that is willing to spend the money to invest in things like infrastructure and education, can greatly impede the ability of a peripheral country to develop. A lot of times these governments, if they're corrupt, they're only in it for the money for themselves and their friends, so they are not looking to do what's best for the country. So that money literally is stolen. In many different countries, Haiti being a great example, suffered under a dictator that lived a very lavish lifestyle and that did not spend any of the money on the people, and therefore those people still are living in poverty. North Korea is very similar. Unstable governments that are being switched around, and I'm not meaning by elections, but by different types of government, where governments will come in and military will take over, then a dictator might come in, and then somebody else comes in, right? If they're very unstable and there's no sense of continuity with regard to the direction of the country, that can also lead to it. A lot of times when you see these unstable governments, you'll see wide gaps between wealthy and poor, and those wealthy are very, very few. You won't see a traditional well-off middle class. The wealthy control not only the government, but the wealth in there as well. So the few have a lot and keep getting more and more, and the poor are not benefiting. Core countries typically end up being democratic countries. They have regular elections. Those elections are legitimate, which means they're not being thrown in favor of one group or the other. And even though the parties are changing power or individuals are changing power, there is a sense of continuity, right? The major aspects of the country don't change. Peripheral countries do on occasion have democratic governments, but again, that's just one piece of what it takes for a country to develop. Countries like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan do have elected governments, but it's very, very difficult for them to try and overcome some of the other issues. Core countries, oftentimes, if they see that there's a country that is corrupt or somehow illegitimate, will often withdraw any kind of support. So what little money might be coming in from an outside government will at times become will just disappear if they feel like the country is being corrupt. All right, another aspect to development are the costs that come with development. And here you see what we're looking at are export processing zones. And what export processing zones are, special zones that governments are setting up in order to facilitate some type of development, whether that be some type of manufacturing, foreign investment, or the attracting of foreign companies to come in and do work in the country. Right? Remember that when you want to work towards development, there are a lot of costs that are associated that aren't covered by things like GNI, GDP, or GNP. There's a lot of pollution. We've seen that. We talked about London when it was the hub of the Industrial Revolution, that London fog was really indeed pollution. We've seen pictures of Beijing. And it's interesting to note that during this time of the coronavirus, Beijing's air has been cleaner than it's been in a long time because a lot of those factories have shut down. There's damage to the water. There might be damage to the soil with any kind of artificial fertilizers or pesticides. Tourism also is an aspect of development we'll look at in a little bit, but it too has costs. It taxes the infrastructure because people are using more of it, and by infrastructure I don't just mean roads, but airports, hotels, hospitals, possibly for people who get sick, and there's also some damage that is done to the culture of the country itself. But let's go back to these export processing zones. All right, they often, like I said, are looking to attract foreign investment. So they'll offer all kinds of favorable tax situations, a little less regulatory rules might be involved, and also trade arrangements, particularly to some type of foreign investment. In Mexico, their particular types of export processing zones are called maquiladoras. And maquiladoras is areas, most of them are on the northern border with the United States. They were set up in the 60s, and they were to attract the American companies that were looking for cheap labor, right? They would attract those companies to build factories in those export processing zones. Mexico offered very favorable tax rates. Their regulatory laws regarding the environment are not as strict as the United States, and those environmental rules are very expensive. It's expensive for a company to have to deal with protecting the environment. Mexico's laws are not as strict as the United States, and they didn't have any kind of import tariffs on companies that did business in these particular maquiladoras. In 1992, the United States, Mexico, and Canada entered into NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. And that even facilitated the growth of these maquiladoras because even more tax benefits were available to U.S. companies that would go across the border. Currently, of course, we're having issues with immigration and whether or not the United States is going to allow immigrants to go across the border daily for jobs. That has caused tensions between the government of the United States and Mexico, and it remains to be seen what, if any, problems that may cause for the maquiladoras. Additionally, as a company gets more and more developed, the cost of labor goes up. So a lot of times companies will see that they can get cheaper labor somewhere else, and they may pull up stakes in Mexico, leave those factories there, and then take their business elsewhere. China also has a number of export processing zones as well. We've talked about those before, where you see some aspects of capitalism are allowed to take place under the watchful eye of the Beijing government. In the slide, you'll also notice too that countries that tend to be more core have more processing zones. Periphery tends to have none. It's expensive. You can't give up all that tax money. Maybe you can't afford to have that damage done to your environment. So a lot of countries will not have any kind of export processing zone simply because they cannot afford it. All right, let's look a little bit at agriculture with regard to development. In peripheral countries, agriculture tends to focus on personal consumption, what the subsistence farmer, what they can make for themselves and make for their families. It's not really large-scale commercial farming that we see in the United States and Canada. Any real large-scale production that you will find in a peripheral country are typically owned by foreign companies. Remember way back when we looked at Kenya and their tea and coffee industry, right? Those companies are owned by foreign investors, and all of those crops that are grown are meant to be exported. They're not meant for the consumption of the peripheral country. They're meant to be exported where they can get a higher dollar, right? Personal farming is done in very small farms. A lot of times these farms are very unproductive because the land has been farmed and farmed and farmed. There is no chance for the soil to regenerate, so they're not making as much money as they did before. A lot of times the people in the peripheral countries are just too poor to buy any food that's available at the market, right? They have to grow their own. And most of the time they're not growing protein, right? So there's not a lot of animals that are being raised in order to facilitate protein consumption, right? One of the reasons that we looked at Heifer International as a place where you can contribute to protein consumption of some places like this. Also, you have issues of soil erosion, right? Soil erosion is caused again because you are constantly overtaxing the soil, and you are making it weaker and weaker, right? You are clearing land. You're taking root systems out from like trees and other growth that can keep the soil down. There isn't a lot of chemical fertilizers and pesticides that are available, so you can continue to use that same piece of land. So when the land dries up and it can't produce anymore, they go clear another piece of land. We'll talk a lot more about this in chapter 11. On the slide in front of you now, you see areas that are threatened by desertification. Desertification comes about where you have desert-like areas that are literally growing, right? They are getting bigger. Look particularly at the Sahara in northern Africa. Severe soil erosion in areas with a dry or a semi-arid climate, meaning they don't get a lot of rain, and areas that are around deserts result in degradation of the soil, right? It's not producing anymore, so you're having more and more problems, and they leave it to go farm some other area. Well, then the land, the topsoil gets eroded away, whether it be through water, more likely through wind, and then the desert will continue to spread out, right? It is caused by this overusing of land by humans, also clearing of land for animals, right? Livestock to graze. As people become more and more wanting a Western diet, as they become more developed, we have to have more land because people want to eat more beef. Right? And the last thing we're going to look at is tourism. Right? Tourism can be a very profitable thing for some countries, but it has a lot of cons with it as well. Right? It requires a lot of investment by the host country in infrastructure, airports as well as roads. A lot of times local people don't own those resorts, so the money that comes in from the resorts leaves the country and goes to the foreign investors. It does provide some local jobs, but those local jobs are often low paying, and they don't go year round. They're seasonal. So if you're at a resort that won't attract people during a particular season, or people don't travel because they don't want to go in nice weather, they want to wait till they're having bad weather, that may be a problem. And so sometimes, they don't get a job for the full year. And then the last part about it too is that local culture is often very much, there's that stinky thing again. Okay, so we got rid of that. Local culture sometimes is often left to appeal to the tourist, right? So they make it a caricature of the culture and not the real culture, right? This is what people want to see. Remember back to the lost city in South Africa, right? People want to see African animals, even though that may not be something that's particular to the local. You're appeasing the tourists. And then the last part about this too is that if you are overly dependent upon tourism and that tourism goes away, look at the Yucatan Peninsula and the Cancun area that was destroyed in several hurricanes. If that goes away, then what do people do? There's not really a lot left for them. So tourism can be a great thing and it can be a bad thing, right? Nothing is ever just completely good or completely bad. All right, this is the end of this particular video, and will be the end of what you do today. So go ahead and finish this out. Go to the assignment for 10.2 chapter, upload that, and I will see you, sort of, the next A-Day.